A Legend of Orkney Witchcraft. The Witches of Howan Greeny. In Orkney, records survive of at least 72 named individuals, with the majority of those accused being women. St Magnus Cathedral in Kirkwall housed both the prison and courtroom. Those sentenced to death were taken to Gallows Ha at the top of Clay Lone, tied to a stake, strangled, and then burnt. In the Weekly Scotsman, V.M. Henderson wrote of the legend of the Witches of Howan Greeny. It was reprinted in the South Eastern Times of the 31st of January 1930. On a dark February night in the year 1600, a servant lad named James Frischel overheard a mysterious conversation beside the haunted hill of Howan Greeny. Howan Greeny was the fairy hill of the parish of Rendell in Orkney, where mortals disappeared at times, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. A cry had brought the lad to the place. Cautiously he crept towards the haunted spot, and dimly he could make out in the darkness the figures of 2 women and a tall man, black and indistinct as a shadow. At first he could hear only the whispered portions of sentences, but creeping nearer he heard what transfixed him to the spot. "Don't ask us to do it," he heard one woman say, whose voice betrayed her to be a reputed witch, Kitty Grieve. "Already people credit us with holding communication with the Evil One, and what would become of us if this were known? Who dare lift a finger to injure you, as long as you have my protection?" asked the stranger. "That may be so, my lord, but do not ask us to do this revolting work. We will do everything possible in the future, as we have done in the past, to carry out your commands. But spare us this." "And what say you, Richard, to this proposal?" said he to the other woman. "Have you also got a nice over trifles?" "You know that we are your lordship's slaves," was the reply. "Hitherto we have given up body and soul to your service, so that we are now as outcasts in the parish, shunned by all. We would—" "Oh, give over this prating," said the stranger impatiently. "You have had your reward for all you have done. Throughout the past months, when others have been starving, you and your families have been fed by me. The bad harvest has not affected you." "We admit all your kindness," Kitty Grieve answered. "But if I had known the terrible price I would be called upon to pay for my daily bread, I should have preferred death to it." "Boldly spoken, Kitty," was the sneering reply. "But if death has so little terror for you, why try to avoid it? You have only to refuse to obey my commands, and within a month the good people of Rendell will crowd to the hill over there to watch the flames devour your bodies at the gallows in Kirkwall. I give you both 3 minutes to decide your fate." At this the women burst into tears, while the stranger walked away a few steps. Returning, he commanded angrily, "Well, you obey, or do you prefer to end your lives at the stake?" The lad, Frischel, did not hear the reply, but presently the trio left Howan Greeny and proceeded across the moor, where he lost sight of them. He then searched the ground cautiously. At one place he picked up a casel, in which there was a large quantity of black oatmeal, and farther on he discovered a woolen shawl and a piece of blue worsted cloth. The find of oatmeal being a valuable one in these times of scarcity, Frischel concluded that the witches would return for it, and he decided to await them and confront them. Nearly 2 hours elapsed, however, before he saw the forms of the old women through the gloom, and heard them conversing with each other in whispers. The mysterious stranger was no longer with them, so Frischel boldly advanced and said, "Here is your kessel of meal. Would you not give other poor bodies a chance of something to eat, and tell me who gives this food to you? He might have more to spare." "Would you serve the devil?" snapped Kitty Grieve. "If so, be sure he is not far away. He is aye at hand when people want him." Immediately Frischel turned and fled, pursued from the haunted hill by the mocking laughter of the witches. Next day it became known in Rendell that a young woman of means, Mary Linklater, had disappeared. On the previous night she and her lover, Thomas Irvine, had been seen crossing the moor arm in arm in the direction of Howan Greeny. When Irvine was told that she had not returned to her father, he was distressed and amazed. He said he had wanted to accompany her home as usual, but she had insisted on parting with him halfway across the moor. She had refused to tell him why, and when he had laughingly said that perhaps the fairies might get her, she had as lightly retorted that she would enjoy a dance with the wee folk. There being no one to corroborate his word, Irvine was somewhat under suspicion, until Fischel came forward and told what he had seen and heard the previous evening. He produced the shawl and the piece of blue cloth, which were identified to have belonged to the missing girl. The finger of accusation was then pointed at the two witches. Information was sent to Kirkwall. The women were apprehended on a charge of witchcraft, and their trial was fixed for the 29th of May, 1600. On the preceding day, Kitty Grieve and Mary Reichardt were placed in the stocks at the cross at Kirkwall. They were pelted with rubbish and derided. Early in the afternoon a strange priest arrived, who waved the crowd impatiently back that he might converse with the culprits. After a long discourse in a low tone of voice, he turned to the onlookers and bade them begone and leave the old women in peace until they were condemned. At the trial a number of charges of witchcraft and sorcery were held by the jury to have been proved, but to everybody's surprise Mary Reichardt was dismissed with an admonition, whilst Kitty Grieve, who had first pleaded guilty and had then changed her mind, was sentenced to be taken to the cross by the hangman and to be publicly branded on the cheek with branding irons. Both women, said the judge in explanation, were widows with large families, and to have burned them at the stake would have been to prejudice the lives of their children, at a time when want was abroad, and children could ill afford to do without their protectors. The real explanation of the mystery of the disappearance, and of the leniency of the sentences passed on the guilty witches, came to light some months later. Kitty Grieve, whose health never recovered from the branding irons, was about to die, and before her death she made a full confession. As a young woman she had been engaged as a nurse at Earl Stuart's palace in Kirkwall. One of the boys whom she nursed, an illegitimate son of the Earl, grew up a wild young man, and leaving home, at length added piracy to his other crimes. He often came with his ship to Orkney for the purpose of robbing his own people. Always he kept a friendly feeling for his own nurse, and her fellow servant, Richard. He brought them presents from his pillaging expeditions. By and by he came to make demands upon them. They must get him certain information, otherwise they would get no more from him. But on the contrary, he would have them shown up as being his accomplices, and without doing himself any harm. Thus they became his informers, letting him know whenever valuables were to be found. So he came to know that Mary Linklatter's father had amassed a fortune, and that Mary knew where it was hidden. Then the two old servants persuaded Mary to meet them alone at Howan, Greeny, on the plea that they would take her to see an old woman who was dying of starvation. Kind-hearted Mary fell into the trap. Stuart seized her, and when she would not tell where her father's valuables were secreted, he struck her so violently on the head with the back of his sword that he killed her on the spot. Then he forced the two women to come with him and bury her body in the moss. Further, Kitty Grieve alleged that it was Stuart who, in the guise of a priest, had conversed with her companion and herself when they were in the stocks at Kirkwall Cross. It was through his intervention that the judge was persuaded not to condemn them to be burnt at the stake. Mary Reichardt had promised to say nothing which would incriminate Stuart. She, Kitty Grieve, had threatened to expose him, for which reason she was branded. She admitted that she had given Fischel to understand that it was the evil one with whom she and Mary Reichardt held converse on the night of the murder, but she still held that was a faithful description of Stuart. She denied, however, that she had ever had any supernatural gifts such as witches were credited with possessing. As this confession implicated a member of one of the first families of Orkney, no steps were taken to test its truth by trying to find the body. After a lapse, however, of 250 years, a peat cutter working in the moss came upon the remains of a female. By the clothing which had been preserved by the moss, and which had been particularly described at the trial, the body was identified as being that of Mary Linklater, thus bearing out the confession of one of the reputed witches of Howan Greeny. A different version of the legend is told in Peace's Orkney Almanac, which was published in 1913 and reprinted in the Orkney Herald on May 26, 1943. 17th century witchcraft in Orkney. The first half of the 17th century was a time of witch-burning in Orkney. The evidence, as might be expected in a period when people were sunk in superstition, was often of a most ludicrous kind. Sometimes two accusations were made from feelings of malice and ill will. In the parish of Evie there lived a widow named Kitty Grieve, or Miller, with a family of several children. She became suspected of witchcraft, and in consequence was feared and hated by her superstitious neighbours, and after a time brought to trial as a witch. The case against her contains charges of practising witchcraft, sorceries, divinations, and charms, and giving herself forth to have such craft and knowledge, thereby abusing the people, and that by her cursings and imprecations she wronged and hurt man and beast, which evil was brought to pass by the working of the devil, her master. Here are some of the items in the indictment. At some distance from her house was a hillock called Howan, Greeny, on the top of which were the ruins of an old house. The place was thought to be haunted, and people quickened their steps if they had to pass by it after sunset. One day, in the spring of 1627, a boy named James Frischel, who was herding swine on the hill, took shelter from the cold and rain in this old ruin. Here he found Kitty Grieve, Mary Richard, who was his grandmother, who was also reputed to be a witch, and the devil, in the guise of a man in black. Catherine, angry at being discovered, called out fiercely to her companion to take him, the boy, for he would tell upon them. But the boy's grandmother said nobody would believe the boy, and he was allowed to go. Next day he told his master, Magnus Smith, what he had seen. Years afterwards, when Catherine and Mary were sitting in the stocks, Catherine reminded her companion of this incident, and pointed out that the boy was now a witness against them. A few months later, a woman in Evie, Ursula or Osley Fee, was churning milk in the firehouse of her small farm. There was a big peat fire in the hearth, which stood in the middle of the floor, and was composed of stones built to the height of about 3 feet on the back and both sides. She worked for hours, but no butter came, and at last, sweating and tired, she heated a large stone, put it in the churn, and got 2 pounds of butter, or about 1/4 of the usual quantity. Osley, believing now that Catherine had taken away the profit of the milk, sent her servant to milk the witch's cow. When the servant came back, the 2 milks were mixed, and in a few minutes Osley had 9 pounds of butter from the same quantity of milk that she could not, with all her spaying and plouting, get any from before. But she was punished for daring to milk Catherine's cow. Within 24 hours she was seized with a severe illness, which continued until after about 6 weeks' suffering, she, at the witch's request, drank from the churn, and was at once restored to health. But the profit of the milk was again gone, and according to the evidence of witnesses at Catherine's trial, no amount of churning had since availed to make butter. On one occasion, Catherine, asked to cure a sick horse, advised the owner to get 3 different kinds of silver, put them in a sieve, and sift them over the back of the horse. It is not recorded what the effect was. Her daughter once went and took, without permission, cabbages from the yard of one John Brown, a farmer in Evie. His servant reproved the girl, and suffered for doing so, for when the girl told her mother what had happened, Catherine bade her take the cabbages back and throw them at the servant. This was done, and the servant was so seriously injured by being struck on the chest by a cabbage that she was ill for a fortnight. Catherine herself went to Brown's house and told him she had dreamt that if his wife would give alms to her daughter, the servant would immediately recover. Alms were given, and the result was as Catherine had promised. One of Catherine's sons was a herd boy to this same farmer, and was dismissed. This angered Catherine, and as her neighbours believed, as a result of her witchcraft, 1 cow died immediately, and all the rest shortly afterwards. Another farmer, who had another of Catherine's sons in his service, had a similar experience. Before sunrise one morning, Catherine went to the house of John Peace, near Kirkwall. John's wife ordered her off, and was instantly seized by an extraordinary disease, which made her unable to walk from her mother-in-law's house to her own, though they were close together, and she had to creep on her hands and knees. Catherine was sent for, and laid a hand on the sick woman's head and gave her a drink of milk. The woman instantly recovered the use of her limbs. Catherine was tried before a sheriff and jury in the Wall House of the cathedral in Kirkwall on the 29th of May, 1633. She was found guilty and sentenced to be carried by the lockman to the cross and burned on the cheek. The sentence was a lenient one, for death was the usual penalty for the crime of witchcraft. Catherine, however, only escaped that penalty by binding herself that if at any time thereafter she should be found to haunt suspected places, or to use charms or the like, she should in that case be burnt without doom to her death, and that willingly of her own consent. So there you have two versions of the legend of Howan Greeny. And where is the truth? In the dark corners of history.